Two families lived in the same suburb outside Dallas. They earned almost the same money. 10 years later, one couple had $140,000 in retirement savings. The other had $620,000. That gap didn't come from some secret investment strategy. It came from a house. Daniel and Rebecca Collins bought the bigger one. 4 bedrooms, more yard, more status. The kind of house people point to and say they're doing well. Marcus and Elena Brooks bought the smaller one, less impressive, less space, less to show off. The kind of house people quietly assume you'll upgrade out of. By 2026, one family had built wealth. The other had built a beautiful financial trap. That's the lie almost nobody tells you about housing in America. The bigger house doesn't just cost more to buy. It changes every other financial decision orbiting your life. Your savings rate, your stress level, your career flexibility, your retirement age. And because all of that damage happens slowly, it doesn't feel like destruction. It feels like progress. In 2016, Daniel and Rebecca earned a combined $155,000 a year and bought a 4-bedroom house for $320,000. Their mortgage, including taxes and insurance, was $2,100 a month. It stretched them, but not enough to feel reckless. They told themselves what millions of Americans tell themselves when they buy more house than they need. We'll grow into it. 2 kids, a home office, a guest room when parents visit. Maybe a larger yard would be good for the children. None of it sounded irresponsible. In fact, it sounded prudent. A few streets over, Marcus and Elena Brooks earned slightly more $162,000 a year, but bought a 3-bedroom house for $215,000 with a $1,400 monthly mortgage. Their kids shared a room longer than they wanted. The office doubled as a guest room. It wasn't glamorous. Visitors sometimes hinted they could afford something nicer. And that's what makes this story dangerous. Because if one family had obviously made a foolish decision, there'd be no lesson here. But Daniel and Rebecca didn't look reckless. They looked successful. That's where most people stop thinking. They see a $700 difference in mortgage payments and assume that explains the gap. It doesn't. That $700 is the decoy. Because the real cost of a bigger house doesn't sit in the mortgage payment. It hides in taxes that rise quietly, maintenance that arrives in waves, utility bills that scale without asking permission, and a form of lifestyle inflation most homeowners never recognize until years later. And that's what we're actually investigating here. Not whether a bigger house costs more, everyone knows that. The question is why a decision that looks like upward mobility can over 20 or 30 years quietly destroy more wealth than almost any other financial mistake a middle-class family makes. And once you see the math, it becomes very hard to unsee it. Here's where most buyers make the same mistake. They look at the mortgage payment and ask a single question: can we afford it? If the payment falls below 28 to 30% of gross income, the bank approves the loan, the buyer feels validated, and the decision feels financially responsible. But that calculation is dangerously incomplete, because the mortgage payment is often only about half the true cost of owning a house. When Daniel and Rebecca chose the larger home, they thought they were taking on an extra $700 a month compared with Marcus and Elena. But the mortgage wasn't the real difference. It was the invitation to a second layer of costs that didn't appear in the closing paperwork. Property taxes were the first leak. At roughly 1.1% annually, a $500,000 house generates about $5,500 in property taxes each year. A $300,000 house generates about $3,300. That's a $2,200 annual difference before you repair a roof, pay a utility bill, or replace a dishwasher. Then insurance. A larger house costs more to insure. The difference can easily run another $800 a year. Then maintenance. Budget 1 to 2% of a home's value each year for upkeep. On a $500,000 home, that can mean $5,000 to $10,000 annually. On a $300,000 home, maybe $3,000 to $6,000. That's another roughly $3,000 per year disappearing into maintenance drag. Then utilities. More square footage means more air to cool, more rooms to heat. Another $2,400 annually can vanish there. Now add it up. $2,200 in additional taxes, $800 in insurance, $3,000 in maintenance, $2,400 in utilities. That's $8,400 per year in extra costs beyond the mortgage, or $700 a month. And suddenly the $700 bigger mortgage was never $700. It was over $1,400 a month in real economic drag. Take that $16,800 annual difference, not spent, invested. At an average 8% return over 25 years, that becomes roughly $1.3 million. The house didn't cost $200,000 more. It cost over $1 million more once you include what that money could have become. And that's before we even talk about the down payment. To buy a $500,000 home with 20% down takes $100,000. A $300,000 home takes $60,000. That extra $40,000 feels like equity. But from a compounding perspective, it may be a sacrificed future, $274,000 over 25 years. Stretch it to 30 years, and it approaches $402,000. People call the larger down payment investing in the house. But mathematically, it may be disinvesting from everything else. If Daniel and Rebecca had invested the $1,400 monthly housing difference in index funds over 10 years at 8% returns, they'd have roughly $258,000. They don't. The house absorbed it. But the story goes deeper, because the biggest financial damage from a larger house often doesn't come from the mortgage or the taxes or even the maintenance. It comes from what the house quietly makes you feel obligated to do. When Daniel and Rebecca moved in, their old furniture suddenly looked too small. So they bought a sectional for $3,800, a dining table for $2,200, a sitting area for $1,400, bedroom sets for $6,200, then $9,500 in landscaping and patio upgrades, more than $25,000 in the first 3 years. Marcus and Elena spent roughly $4,000. That $21,000 gap invested at 8% over 20 years becomes roughly $98,000. Then came the identity shift. A neighborhood started implying what kind of car belonged in the driveway. When Daniel replaced his car, it wasn't a $19,000 practical vehicle like Marcus bought. It was a $48,000 one that looked appropriate. And appropriate spending is where wealth often dies, because it feels normal, not reckless. The house became an anchor around which every other financial decision started orbiting. Then came the time bomb inside the walls. Daniel and Rebecca replaced their roof in year 7. Cost $18,500. Marcus and Elena, $11,200. Daniel and Rebecca replaced HVAC, $14,000. Marcus and Elena, $8,200. Over 30 years, the maintenance differential alone can exceed $75,000. Then property taxes. A $5,500 tax bill growing at 4% annually becomes roughly $12,049 after 20 years. A $3,300 bill becomes $7,307. That annual gap expands to $4,872, cumulatively more than $70,000. You didn't just buy a bigger house, you committed to a larger tax base for decades. And this is why the trap persists. People have been taught the bigger house is responsible, that it builds wealth. But much of that belief confuses consumption with investment. U.S. home prices have risen roughly 4.1% annually. The S&P 500 has returned about 10.7%. A dollar invested in stocks became roughly $8. A dollar tied up in housing became roughly $3.50. Lauren Mitchell learned that too late. She bought a 4-bedroom colonial outside Boston in 2012 for $580,000. By 2022, her home was worth $940,000, but she still owed $320,000. Property taxes were $14,000 annually, maintenance $12,000, utilities $450 a month, retirement savings just $210,000. If she'd bought a $350,000 condo instead and invested the difference, she may have had roughly $800,000. That gap became 7 extra years of work. Retirement moved from 60 to 67. That's what housing decisions can do. They don't just change net worth. They can change the years of your life you control. Daniel and Rebecca optimized for what people could see. Marcus and Elena optimized for what people couldn't. One built a life organized around obligations. The other built one organized around options. That's what this was always about. Not whether a large house is morally wrong, but whether square footage is worth surrendering decades of compounding. Because when you sign a mortgage, you may be doing more than buying a home. You may be choosing a retirement age. The beautiful irony is that wealth often looks unimpressive while it's being built. No one compliments an index fund. No one admires a low housing ratio, but one day those invisible decisions become visible as freedom. And that may be the real divide between people who look wealthy and people who actually become wealthy. So, before buying more house than you need, ask a harder question. Are you purchasing space or quietly selling future freedom to get it?